Pod. Pod.
Hi mate, sorry about that. I was doing my podcast and it just overran a bit.
For Top Flight Time Machine.
Yeah.
Nice one. Big fan, so.
Oh, good. Yeah, we were just doing more at the Rovers.
Right.
And I lost track of time. Yeah.
Fair. Yeah, that's one that I've not really followed, but been following the Yesterday's Hero. I've been really enjoying.
Oh, good. Yeah, that was a while back we did that. It's like we do so much. People are all at like completely different stages. And it's funny because we do it every day. There's so much, and we've been doing it for so long. People get in touch about things that we have no memory of doing because we've over-podded, basically.
Yeah, I need to get on the history box ones as well because I'm non-IFS at the moment. I apologise, but
that's all right. That's fair enough.
Got a 2-year-old, so
we're doing the death of Diana, the aftermath of the death of Diana at the moment, which is proved really popular. It's really interesting when you start looking into stories of like the mad things in the weeks and months that followed that people did. It's like unbelievable.
Were you involved in that at the time in terms of being in the media and everything?
No, I just started work. I was working on a magazine, but it was like literally, I left university in 97 and I was like in my first sort of job, which was at Men's Health magazine. So yeah, it had nothing to do with that at all. I mean, I've got a lot of memories just as a civilian of the time, which are quite sort of funny in retrospect. But no, I didn't have any involvement in the coverage.
Ah, fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just remember being fuming on the day that all the cartoons were off. That's all I remember.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people saying they remember Liverpool-Newcastle being cancelled.
Oh, really?
We've had a lot of emails about that. Yeah.
Yeah, like obviously like what were you up to at that point in the Naughties and how did you end up speaking to some of those bands?
In the Naughties, I'd been working in the magazine business. I was in my 20s. I'd had the first few years of my career. I'd been working on various magazines, and then in about 2002, I got a job presenting a TV show on Channel 5 called The Edit, and for that we started doing more. It was sort of news and entertainment, so it was supposed to be like youth news, so doing proper stories about politics and whatnot, but for kids, not kids, but young people, and but also mixing pop culture into it. And yeah, we wanted it to be like a magazine but on TV, and we made it at ITN, and we were given a huge amount of freedom. It was myself and Anita Rani, who's now a very sort of famous and popular television presenter. And we were both very young, and they gave us like the reins to sort of, talk, like invite whoever we wanted on and talk about whatever we wanted. And we just had our own half hour of live TV once a week on terrestrial TV. It was like amazing. It was one of those things that you have it when you're young and you sort of think, this is just normal. And it's not until you get older and look back and think, wow, what a privilege that was. We were both really, really into music. And so although the onus, it being an ITM production, was mainly on news, we were always trying to get quite a lot of music content in there. And off the back of that show, we then started doing another show for Channel 5, which was called something like The Chart. I think it was called that. And it was just like, it was just a chart show. We weren't even in Vision. We just voiced it, and we would go, and Sky made that, and we just would go and like basically do a rundown of the chart. But again, they gave us like extreme freedom, and we were quite snobbish about music, both of us in different ways, and thought we were like know-it-alls about music. And so we would be doing the pop chart and doing a countdown, a bit like what me and Andy now do on we do a pod, me and Andy Dawson do a podcast called Top Flight Tune Machine, which is a spin-off from our main podcast, where we just count down the charts of a particular week from the past. And it was like that, but we would write the most horrible, like piss-takey things about all these pop acts that we didn't like or we were sneering about. I feel really embarrassed about it now. But again, it doesn't make any sense that we were given such freedom. I assume it was because no one really watched Channel 5, so the bosses didn't really care what we put out. And while I was doing that, all these things, I decided, I wanted to continue to write, even though I'd had my head turned a little bit by TV. So as guests on the show, we did a thing about the darkness, and they'd never been interviewed before, but someone we knew told our producer that we should come to this gig in Camden Town, and that we'd see I think it was a journalist from the NME, but I can't remember who, told our producer that you're going to see the best rock band in the world right now. And we were like, oh yeah, right. Typical kind of NME hyperbole. And I was a little bit sneering about rock music generally at that time, sort of thing. And but I went along, and I thought, well, and I looked at them. They came on stage, and I thought, this is everything that is naff, right? This is. I thought we'd said goodbye to this stuff in the 80s. This is the sort of stuff that in the 80s, when I was a kid, if you thought you were cool and into cool music, that bands like The Darkness were the opposite of what you liked. That was like American music. And anyway, it was an amazing fucking gig. It was unbelievable, this gig. Like, I'd never heard their music before. I'd never seen them before or anything. And I just thought, that is amazing. And the next day, I think, so we got them onto the TV show. And when they came onto the TV show, I said, I'd love to interview you for print. And they said, oh, great. We haven't done much press yet. Who for? And I'd written a bit for The Guardian, like the features about movies mainly. But I really wanted to write for the Guardian Guide, because in those days, in the noughties, it was a really good magazine. It was like my favourite magazine. A lot of people felt the same way. It was like Charlie Brooker was, when he started out, was writing a really funny column, and they had lots of great writers and lots of really interesting stuff every Saturday. And so I'd wanted to sort of get a foot in the door there for a while. So I just told them confidently, I'll do it for the Guardian Guide. And they said, oh, that'd be great. And then after they'd agreed, I then went to the Guardian Guide and sort of said, listen, they'd not heard of The Darkness, but I'd said, honestly, it's really good. And they said, well, why don't you do a general thing about 80s revivals? Because 80s revivals hadn't happened yet. It was the early noughties. Any sooner than that, you couldn't have an 80s revival. You have to wait at least 1.5 decades before you can revive another decade, right? And they said, oh, maybe you can link it to some other things that are kind of about how the 80s is coming back. So I said, all right, fine, whatever. So that's what I did. I interviewed them, but I made it into a sort of a wider piece about the return of kind of naff 80s sort of cultural features. And then off the back of that, that was my sort of foot in the door with the Guide. And I started writing about for them for about the next sort of 8 years or so, I think it was, maybe more. Well, no, yeah, about 8 years. But particularly between about 2003 and 2009, I wrote very regularly for them, and a lot of that, some of it was film, some of it was TV, but a lot of it was interviewing bands. And I've never, because I wasn't a music journalist, my background wasn't as a music journalist, I didn't have all the relationships with music PRs that a lot of career music journalists do, like the people who've grown up writing at the NME or whatever, and they know all the important PRs, and they kind of, I was lucky because I kind of, I didn't have relationships to sort of get access to bands, but because I sort of developed a good relationship with The Guardian, they would just give me stuff. And I think I was sort of reasonably reliable, which was, looking back, was probably quite unusual for young freelance writers in their 20s at the time. You know, and I know now, having got older and been an editor myself and commissioned stuff, you realize that, you know, a lot of 20-something writers who are freelance are fucking very likely to just disappear or miss deadlines because they're all on drugs or hungover, right? But I was reasonably buttoned down, and I would always deliver a piece of some reasonable quality when I said I would. So they started giving me so much work. And I didn't know bands or their PRs, but it would be great because it was a dream thing. I'd just get a call pretty much every week saying, do you want to go and interview such and such or this person or that person? And I'd just always say, yeah. I mean, I'd never say no. Whether I liked the act or not, or whether I'd even heard of the act or not, was not really here or there. I just always thought it was interesting to go and meet these creative people because I thought it'd always be a fun thing to do.
How excited were you on a personal level about that era of music? Like, I think I've heard you talk about, you know, the Strokes before and stuff like that. How did it compare for you, kind of thing?
I really, I suppose, let's think. I mean, yeah, I suppose the 90s, my era of being, you know, a big era for me would have obviously been like the mid-90s and the Britpop era. That was when I was a student at university. And then I felt that the late 90s became a little bit tedious and boring. There was a lot of shit pop in the charts, and guitar music, there was a lot of kind of overhang from Oasis. So there was a number of bands in the late 90s. People kept saying they're the new Oasis. And there was, for me, it was like when you started to get a sort of what I found quite dreary transition into anthemic rock, which I was commercially very successful, but I personally was not particularly a big fan of. And so in the noughties, what I suppose excited me actually was there wasn't a huge amount of great guitar music in like around 2002, 2003. I'm sure there was, but not that I was sort of motivated by. But I felt that there was like a new kind of mainstream pop music that was from America and that was very credible. So rather than shit kind of Euro pop, Stock Aitken and Waterman sort of stuff, it was when the Neptunes and Pharrell began. There was a period in the early noughties where like every second song in the charts had been written or produced by the Neptunes, but they were like really good. And it wasn't like when every second song was being produced by Stock Aitken and Waterman. This was like every act was being produced by some really super talented, extremely credible, sort of soul hip hop producers. And so I was really very excited by that sort of music. And I remember actually sitting down with another journalist who I was friends with, who I think was working at the NME at the time. And we were bemoaning the fact that the Face magazine, which had been very influential over me and probably other journalists of my generation in the 80s and 90s, was in decline. I think it was shut around that time. It's been revived now, but around that time it was about to be shut. And, we were talking about trying to convince one of the magazine publishers that we worked with to basically not reboot the Face, but do something similar where you picked up on sort of music that was kind of mainstream in that you saw it in the charts, but at the same time, quite cool and credible and not sort of synthetic. And we actually ended up drafting sort of like an idea for a magazine, which I think I called Bubblegum. And, and it would have been Pharrell and Beyonce on cover one. And that was the sort of music that I was really into. But as far as guitar music goes, I did get more sort of interested when the Strokes and the White Stripes suddenly became huge. And I was a huge fan, as I suppose most people were, of the Strokes' first album, which I guess was about 2001.
Yeah.
And the White Stripes, then I really liked as well, though I got a bit bored of them. And then I suppose the next act to come along that were huge after that in that era were the Arctic Monkeys, who were the next band that I sort of, because I think that I went through phases with guitar music. Like, I was very into sort of Britpop and things in the 90s, and then I became very cynical about it and didn't kind of generally like that sort of music. But once in a while, a band sort of cut through and seemed to have the tunes beyond just the look and the sound. And I guess those two are the main ones that people think of when they think of the noughties, I guess.
And from gathering what you said on Top Flight Time Machine, you weren't a big fan of the Kaiser Chiefs.
No, I mean, for me, they weren't really my cup of tea. I do actually remember, I'm saying I was cynical about guitar music, but I tell you what I loved was XFM in that era. Christian O'Connell was a brilliantly creative DJ. They had lots of other good people on there. We used to, on that show that I mentioned, The Edit, we were all big fans, not so much even of all the music they played on XFM, but of the output. It was a really cool station. I don't know, maybe for your generation, it does sort of, people do talk about it. I feel that era on XFM doesn't get talked about enough, Zoe Ball, I think, was doing a show on it at the time. Gideon Coe, a lot of people who are now kind of, quite well known everywhere else. Ricky Gervais, Adam and Joe, great comedians were on there. But Christian O'Connell in the morning, I just thought was brilliant. And I think that was an example of a radio station that I listened to for the presenters more than the music. And then, but as a result of just tuning in to listen to the presenters being funny, you were exposed to a lot of, quite good music, some shit music that I hated, but some music that I wouldn't otherwise have heard or seeked out, Kaiser Chiefs were on there a lot. I remember that. They were being played a lot. But yeah, for me, I just thought, I don't know. There were just bands that I thought were kind of playing, like there were indie bands that I suppose, the sort of lineage of indie bands went from sort of, Joy Division to the Smiths to the Stone Roses, and then on to bands like Oasis in the 90s. And there all seemed to be a line that kind of, you could see where the evolution was and how there was a line that ran through all of these bands. But then there was bands like, I felt that like by the noughties, indie had become the opposite of indie, in as much as you saw bands that were sort of like the Monkees were to the Beatles. They had been manufactured. I don't know if this is true. I'm not saying it's true. The Kaiser Chiefs, I'm sure they came up and paid their dues like anyone else. But sometimes it looked like packaged indie that had been made up by a marketing professional at a big record label. I have no idea whether that's true, but that's maybe what it seemed like to me and why I was cynical about it. But I was a lot more cynical then about music generally than I try to be now. I mean, now I'm very open-minded about most music, and I used to get, and I think it's probably common with people in their 20s and teens, I used to get angry in the same way that you get angry and tribal about football. But I gave up being like that about music a long time ago.
No, we've had a lot of people on talking about kind of, I suppose it's like any scene though, where you get the early stage of originality, and then people want to capitalize on that, copy it, and try and make the most of it. So I don't know if it's the same as other scenes, or whether it was a lot more dross at that point, whether people were trying to capitalize on stuff like the Strokes a lot more than they would something like grunge or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there were other sort of bands that I thought were loosely linked to that. I can't even remember what they called that scene. But it feels like it was the Strokes and the White Stripes were the two sort of main players. What was it? What was it? What did they call that?
Well, that's the thing. It ended up getting called the Indie Landfill.
Yeah, but I don't think.
Not originally.
I think of bands like, I don't know, English bands like, I think of bands like Star Sailor or the Pigeon Detectives or the
Cortinas.
Yeah, or what was that other one who did Chelsea Dagger?
Oh God, yeah, that's the peak of it. Fratelli's.
Yeah. So that for me was like, that was a lot of English bands who were like, who you'd always see going as guests on Soccer AM, wearing anoraks and being a bit sulky, right? And it was like an unconvincing impression of Liam Gallagher, right? So that was the stuff that I thought, oh, that's a bit embarrassing. That's what I always took to be the indie landfill stuff, right?
Yeah.
You'd see them doing that thing where you have to kick the ball through the hole on Soccer AM in the car park, right? That those bands existed just for that item on Soccer AM, right? But the American bands, the foreign bands, didn't seem like that. I don't think, there were other good bands, and there was sort of quite heavy rock bands that did sort of win me over. I remember liking the Vines; they were a good band. And who are the Swedish lot? The Hives.
Yeah.
And that was a bit sort of a throwback to new wave punk from the CBGB's era. That's what they all looked like and dressed like and were clearly heavily influenced by. And I was too young to have remembered that the first time round. I was aware of it because obviously you're aware of cool bands like Blondie and Talking Heads or what have you. And MC5 seemed to be the other thing that everyone was always going on about as an influence. So I was quite interested in that. And in fact, I went to New York and stayed in the hotel around that time, which was next to the old site of CBGB's, and remember feeling quite cool going for a burger across the street in the place that Debbie Harry sings about in one of her famous songs or another. And that was very much like the thing in music at the time, was that the Bowery and CBGB's and, that sort of late 70s, early 80s New York scene seemed to be the big influence on the Strokes and everyone else who wanted to be like the Strokes. And I got quite into that. People started wearing leather jackets again and Converse trainers and wearing their hair quite dirty and lank.
Yeah, I was talking to my mate the other day while looking at a picture, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that's when I went for 6 months without washing my hair." I was like, "Fucking hell, I didn't know that. That's mental."
Yeah. To look like Julian Casablancas.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, he just looked like a homeless person.
I remember people saying about when they used to straighten their hair and it used to like smell like bacon was cooking or something. Awful. What did you make of people like Pete Doherty then? Kind of that kind of scene.
Yeah, I guess that was loosely related to it, wasn't it?
Just because obviously people of my generation obviously were well into that, but I know that people maybe of a different generation kind of saw through it a bit. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was still only in my 20s, but by then I guess I was coming to my late 20s, and I suppose I did have a little bit of cynicism about people posturing as rock and roll, because you get to a stage where you've seen it happen time after time, and you've seen all the tropes, and you're acutely aware of the cliches. And the Libertines, I thought, did some absolutely brilliant songs, really great songs. So I liked them for their music, but I was less enamored with the whole kind of, elegantly wasted, heroin chic Camden town scene. I thought that was a bit corny and cliched, and sort of, it always seemed to me like they were probably posh kids pretending to have a bit of an edge. And again, I was probably wrong, but that was, my cynical mind. I thought that, I mean, I thought I've grown up in London, but I've always thought that about any scene that revolves around Camden Town. It always feels a little bit like posh kids slumming it, as a sort of a posture to see.
Yeah.
Cool,
Yeah, I lived in Stoke Newington for a few years, and I knocked around with a few people like that. It's just like privileged indie kids, basically.
Yeah. There's a lot of that about, and those kind of areas in North London, you see it a huge amount. But the fact is, the Libertines did some great songs, and I used to go to the club night Death Disco, which they sung about in one of their songs, because that was in Notting Hill, which was where I lived throughout this era, throughout the noughties. I lived there, and it felt like a really good place to live. There was a lot of good sort of nights and clubs and places to go. We used to go to Death Disco.
Was that Alan McGee's night?
Yeah. And they sing about it in one of their songs. I can't remember which one. Don't Look Back into the Sun, I think it is. And so you felt quite cool for being down there. But it's the only time I've had a fight and been thrown out of a club was at one of those nights. So the memories are mixed for me. I'm not really a club fighter, but that was an instant where I accidentally became one due to alcohol and got thrown out. So I suppose that was vaguely rock and roll.
All right. What caused that? Just the beer?
I think I just paranoid lunatic. I think I don't drink anymore, but one of the many bad things that alcohol did for me was make me like super paranoid. Like, people associate paranoia with drugs, and drugs also made me paranoid, but alcohol made me intensely paranoid. So if ever I got involved in a frat fight, it's usually because too much beer made me think that people were laughing behind my back. So yeah,
no, I was definitely like that on the. Say I was drinking on a hangover, I'd definitely have that paranoia kicking in,
yeah. So
I like at a festival, yeah.
But I went for the NME, because I was writing so much for the guide, and then a friend of mine or someone who I'd worked with on another magazine became, I think, maybe features editor of the NME or something. And I'd never really been a lot of journalists in my generation, probably that would be their starting point where they wanted to write. And I'd written a little bit for my university magazine, mostly about music. And I had written to the NME when I first left university, but I wrote to practically every magazine in London because I just wanted to work on magazines, because that era in the late 90s was a massive boom time for magazines. And I was obsessed with magazines like throughout my childhood and adolescence and teens. So all I wanted to do was work on a magazine. Any magazine would do. And I'd written a little bit about music. So for the university campus magazine at the uni I went to, which was Sussex, I managed to get an interview with a band from Liverpool called Space, right? I don't know if you remember.
I think I heard of him. Did they have like a big single?
They had a couple of hits, and then like sort of in the fag end of Britpop, and then they disappeared. But that was the first band I ever interviewed. It was the first piece I ever had published anywhere, and I was like fucking delighted with it. And I sent this piece out to every single publication, from the NME right down probably to Cage and Avery Bird, because all I wanted was a foot in the door, hopefully at one of the bigger magazine publishers like IPC or EMAP. And in the end, I wound up at Men's Health. That was my first job. But it was fine, because it was like I learned a lot, and it was a foot in the door. But then it all came back round again, because a guy who I'd worked with on another mag ended up a couple of years later featured to NME, and he started commissioning me because he liked what I'd been writing about music in the guide. And one of the first things they did was they sent me to New York to interview Scissor Sisters, when Scissor Sisters had first sort of had a hit. And I was aware of Scissor Sisters from listening to XFM. XFM played, maybe it was Take Your Mama, which like they just played it to death. I thought it was Elton John when I first heard it. But I liked it because I love disco music. You know, I absolutely fucking love disco music. And I thought, wow, this is really refreshing, because it sounds like disco. It's like not just generic indie music. And I remember this mate of mine from the NME just said, look, do you want to go and interview them? It's in New York. It's in 2 days' time. You got to fly out there. We'll send a bike round with your plane tickets. The record company, I'm not joking, right? And I still don't understand this. And music journalists who are way more experienced than me might say, yeah, that was normal. But the record company sent a bike to my flat with the plane tickets plus an envelope of US dollars. And that is the only time in my journalistic career I suppose I could have been guilty of taking payola, as they call it, right? And I have no idea. I remember the exact bloke, because he went, our paths crossed again years later, and he was the publicist at the record label. And I rang him. He went, did you get the tickets? I went, yeah. I said, what's this envelope? He went, oh, that's for expenses. I was like, what? I was almost like, I've got to send this back. This is mental. But like I say, I don't know, because I never really, you know, you've had much more kind of auspicious and experienced music writers on here than me, and I wasn't in that world enough to know whether or not there was anything normal about it. But obviously, I just took the money, spent it, and then might have like sent off a couple of crumpled receipts to, you know, back to the record company. But it seems peculiar to this day. But it was tremendously exciting to go out there and spend like a day with Scissor Sisters, hanging around in New York, interviewing them as I went along. Absolutely felt brilliant, because they were a New York band, you know, who were very hot at the time. It was my first story for the NME, and it was a cover story. And I've actually tried to buy that, because I lost a lot of my old magazines, but I would like to get that off eBay at some point, because it would be nice to have that. I did, you know, it's the first and only cover story I did for the NME. And it was a band who I really liked, actually, you know, and I went to see them live in London a few times after that. And I liked their first sort of 3 albums or so. You know, I don't suppose the particularly cool kind of indie kids who love loud guitar music were that enamored by it. But for me, it was perfect, because it was a crossover between kind of indie-ish music, but, you know, very pop with a big amount of disco. And I like that sort of thing. And I thought they were great. They cited influences such as Prince, who's my all-time favorite artist, and they harked back to a much more flamboyant way of being a pop band, which I really liked, because that's how bands were in the 80s when I was growing up. And I felt that in the 90s, they became obsessed with seeming ordinary. So Oasis were massive, but one of the things that people liked about Oasis was that they looked like you. They looked like yeah, the lads who you went to the pub or the football with. They just wearing fucking anoraks, you know. And I remember liking that at the time. Then when I got older, I thought, hang on, in the 80s, the whole point of being a pop star was you were larger than life. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
70s, people like David Bowie or Mark Bolan. Then in the 80s, you were fucking Madonna or Prince, right? Or Freddie Mercury. And then for about a decade or two, it was just all about who can look the most like a dreary suburban bloke who works in the supermarket, right? And so I really liked Scissor Sisters because they were all fucking larger than life and totally over the top in the way they dressed and behaved. And their music was very camp and over the top as well. And ultimately, that, for me, is what pop music should always be about. And then about a year after that, I went back to New York again for the Guardian to interview, what's his name? LCD Soundsystem.
Oh, I read that recently, yeah, James Murphy.
Yeah, James Murphy. And again, this was when the term hipster was first becoming very mainstream. And he was basically regarded as the king of the hipsters, right? He was like from Williamsburg, where it all started, and was just like almost painfully cool in all of his cultural references. And everyone wanted to cite him or reference him or say that they were working with him. And that sort of thing instinctively puts me off people and things, when it's like it's too cool that it almost goes full circle. And the Guardian said, just go and interview him. I said, what do you want me to interview him about? And they said, just ask him like what things he's into, because he's like the king of the cool kids. And so whatever he's into, we want to know. And I thought, fucking hell. But obviously it was a free trip to New York. So I went, and this is so sort of entitled and privileged, but I just remember having the ump because I just had to sit in this sound check for like 5 hours or something. And it was completely overrunning. And then we eventually came out and we went for a Japanese meal, me and him and his publicist. And I just had to ask this bloke who was fully convinced of his own coolness to tell me what cool things he was into. Now, I fucking understand that it was a privilege to be there and it was a great job, and I shouldn't be fucking moaning about having opportunities like that. But I remember being a right grumpy bastard on my trip to New York with James Murphy, and we didn't really click with each other. Whereas the Cynicism, it was the opposite. We totally fucking clicked, and I had a great time and came away thinking that they were my mates for life.
Yeah, with the Cynicism, we just like knocking around with them for a bit rather than it being a sit-down interview.
Yeah, it was like one of those days where they were doing a photo shoot for the NME, then they were doing other things that they had to do, and I just kind of hooked up with them in the morning and then just spent the day with them, and they were like extremely friendly, very kind of fabulous, in every way, particularly animatronic. And, they were just a right laugh. And I was like really taken by them. And I remember asking them what records influenced them, but not in that, you're so cool, tell me what cool things you're into, which is what happened with James Murphy. It was more like, I just fucking thought that they were amazing. And I wanted to know everything I just wanted to know loads about what music they were into and stuff. And I remember them I remember them saying that the two albums that they wouldn't exist without, and that they'd based almost everything about themselves on, were Purple Rain and Midnight Vultures by Beck. And obviously I already owned Purple Rain and was very familiar with it. And that was what really endeared me to them even more, because at that stage, Prince is a name that everyone will drop now. But this again was a time before some of these artists had sort of been revived as a cool reference point. They might have still been regarded as like just mainstream pop or whatever. And I was delighted by the fact that they were like not citing, what the obvious band to cite was at the time. They said Prince, Purple Rain, and they said Beck, Midnight Vultures. I think that's what the album's called. But I remember going to Tower Records on Times Square the next day and buying it immediately on CD and listening to it on my Discman all the way home.
Yes. I remember talking about the being cool thing. I was reading your article with Black Rebel Motorcycle Club.
Yeah.
It's quite funny. Some of the stuff. Oh, really? Yeah, some of the stuff you wrote in that was quite funny in terms of, he said something like he was turning down $500,000 every other week or something.
Yeah, I can't. I can't remember the content. I will go back and read that article, but I do remember that being another one that I didn't enjoy. And these are hardly any. Most of them I just fucking really like. I love always meeting very creative people, right? And asking them how they work and getting insight to what makes them tick. And, you know, anyone who's putting their fucking head above the parapet, you know, whether it's Kaiser Chiefs or whoever it fucking is, I've got a huge amount of respect for, and I'm fascinated by them, even if their output isn't fully to my taste, you know, because creative people are interesting. And so I have to say that on the whole, that's why I did all this stuff. And like how I said at the beginning, I didn't really care who they sent me to interview. I didn't have to like their work. And I would try my best as well to be positive about their work, not in a kind of bland way, but there was something positive to say about everyone, and it wasn't about my personal taste, you know. And so I don't want to sound like, oh, I was grumpy with all these people, but if I remember, I don't have many people often say, who are the worst people you interviewed? And I don't have many stories like that, because most people are on their best behavior when they meet someone from the press. But I remember Black Rebel Motorcycle Club sitting in a suite in one of these posh hotels in Park Lane, where they do their sort of press days, and just finding it really like pulling teeth, because they were so falling over themselves to be cool and disinterested and cynical about doing press. It's one of those situations where they think, oh, we've got to do press, but doing press really cheapens us. And we have instinctive mistrust for any journalist. And you're there just trying to do your job. And you think, for fuck's sake, mate, you know, all right, you might not want to be here. I don't particularly want to be here either, but let's just like do what we've both got to do. So I remember being a bit put out by them, and then going to see them actually maybe that same night and thinking, actually, this is just a load of miserable old noise. I mean, you know, they were often the other band mentioned in the same breath as the Strokes. But for me, the Strokes had great melodies that even if you'd changed the genre of music and played the whole thing on a fucking Bontempi organ, a lot of their songs would still sound really good, because it's really just about so much of it starts with melody. And some bands are like more about, we'll get the sound and the look and the production and the PR, and that will be enough. But actually, the bands that actually last the distance and have a bit of a legacy are usually ones who like know how to come up with a melody that could work almost in any genre. I think the Arctic Monkeys were like that. Strokes were like that. Black Rebel Motorcycle Club for me was just like, they had all the gear and no idea.
Now, I remember really liking one of the songs, The Big Spread Your Love, was it? But yeah, apart from that, I don't know much about them apart from that, really. But yeah, it's funny in that interview at one point you say things picked up when he thought he could see an alien behind the curtain or something.
Yeah, I think sometimes when I was writing pieces, if there was what I really liked is you go and interview someone and you press record and you barely have to say anything, and they just say loads of fucking fascinating or funny stuff. Like a couple of years ago, I interviewed Noel Gallagher, and he's like the classic for that. You just don't really need to bother with a question. You just press record, and you could just say to him, right, start talking. And then you'll just come away with like an hour's worth of gold that you just transcribe, and that's it. And I'm happy with that. I don't want to have to put a lot of myself into these articles. But sometimes you go there and it's like pulling teeth, and you think the only way I can make this article work now is to basically tell the story of the encounter with this person, because their quotes are useless. So I need to sort of embellish this by just making it sort of funny and entertaining for other reasons. But when I did that, it usually was indicative of an interview that had gone very badly and that I hadn't enjoyed.
Yeah, fair, yeah. Another band quite similar to Scissor Sisters maybe is Goldfrapp. I saw you writing about. Were you quite into them?
I can't remember interviewing Goldfrapp, but
maybe just writing about them, sorry, yeah.
But yeah, I'd certainly really, really like Goldfrapp. And yeah, I guess you would sort of bracket them with Scissor Sisters. You know, it's sort of like glossy, sophisticated pop music with a sort of a bit of a disco influence. Robin as well, who is one of my all-time favourite artists, and sort of came through in that era, I reckon, sort of mid-noughties, similar time. I bracket them together. There was just great pop music like that I felt was pop, but was still kind of cool, And so it would still be featured in the NME or in cool magazines and stuff, even though really, I'm sure the artists themselves would say this is just pure pop music. You know, this is in the same, you know, line as ABBA or something like that. There was a lot of great female acts, like Goldfrapp. Robin was my absolute favourite. There was LaRue, Little Boots, and I loved all of these artists. And then there was a lot of Scandinavian music. So there was a great band I interviewed in the guide called the Concretes, who were fantastic, who did a brilliant single called You Can't Hurry Love, which I still really love. And I remember spending a great afternoon with them, getting pissed in a restaurant in Charlotte Street, and they were just a right laugh. Quite a large band with men and women in, and I thought they were amazing. And I don't know what became of them, but it was a shame because their first album was brilliant. There was other Scandinavian artists a lot. Scandinavians seem to always consistently have the best pop tunes. There was a female artist called Annie who I interviewed, who had a brilliant hit called Bubblegum, or was it Chewing Gum? Was it Chewing Gum?
I feel like I know that single, yeah. She
was great. And if I'm honest, this doesn't reflect that well on me, but I just kept seeing her pop up on MTV. I had MTV in my home, which at the time felt quite flash. And I was like, and she just kept coming up. And I sort of almost like, I think I just fell in love with her and it's the only time I've done it. And I just emailed the guide and said, I really think I should interview Annie. And they said, okay. And then like within 2 days I was, and that's the sort of real privilege, but you know, there was zero chemistry between us. But it was a brilliant song. I loved that. And the other main interview I was thinking about when you asked me to do this was going to Paris to interview Air. I loved Air. I still love Air. And going to interview them in a restaurant in the Pompidou Centre in Paris felt like the most amazingly sort of French thing anyone could ever do. You know, sitting in the Pompidou Centre with the two members of Air having a really fancy. They'd chosen the restaurant personally, and it was like really fancy place. And they convinced me. They said, "Do you know Paris that well?" And I said, "Not really. I've been here a few times, but I don't know it well." And they sold me on the idea of they were again like a sort of French cliche. And I think I wrote this in the piece. They were obsessed with sex. Like any question you'd say, like, "Oh, so how long did it take to record this album?" And it was literally like Swiss Tony from the Far Show. They were saying shit like, "Well, it's like making love to a woman. You have to be slow and you have to be gentle." And I was like, "Is this some sort of piss take? This is like a sort of a cliche of how you would expect a French person to act." And they go, "You know what? You have a girlfriend?" I said, "Yeah, I've got a girlfriend. You must take her to Paris. Take her for New Year." And I went, and I'd sort of fallen under their spell because it was Air and they were like amazing and really charming and sort of maverick. And I went, "Oh, right. Well, what would we do for New Year?" And they basically gave me a fucking itinerary and told me the specific hotel I should stay in and all the things I should do. And you know what? I did it. I went home and booked it that night, but the whole trip. Probably in my head thinking I'd probably encounter Air and they'd remember it, but I never saw them again. But I did keep saying to my girlfriend, who's now my wife, that trip, "This is where Air told me to book. This is where Air said we should go to eat." So I was quite impressed with myself for that.
Yeah, fair. Was it good? Did it live up to expectation?
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, it was really great. It was Montmartre, which was the sort of trendy kind of district of France. Maybe it still is. In fact, there was an album, a compilation album of great sort of French bands of that time, you know, Daft Punk and Air and Phoenix and so forth. And it was called My Place in Montmartre. So that was obviously where they all hung out. And that's where Air insisted I must book a very specific hotel. Very specific hotel, very specific thing I had to do, and go to Sacre-Cœur at New Year's Eve and all of this stuff. And I just followed it as if they were orders.
Excellent. Just heard you talk a little bit on TFTM about some of the guitar bands that are out now that you're not particularly enamoured with that Six Music push a lot, like the likes of Fontaines DC and Idols. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like I said earlier. I think it's just an age thing, and you see like sort of, I suppose what you call punk posturing come round again and again. And I suppose what it is for me, pop music it's about fun, and it's always an endearing quality to not take yourself very seriously. And I suppose my favorite bands from the Beatles, my absolute favorite band onwards, all had a thing where they had fantastic tunes and they were not taking themselves seriously. And that's just my personal taste. So when you look at bands who would describe themselves as punk bands, they're usually the opposite of that. They're usually very serious. They speak, they kind of posture as being serious and a bit edgy. And the older you get, the less you buy that shit. Do you know what I mean? And so you sort of, but that said, if the songs are good, who cares? I really don't care whatsoever how people behave. But yeah, for me, it's difficult, Six Music. I'm a huge fan of it. But because it's so eclectic, which it prides itself on, it can be very jarring at times when you're listening to, I don't know, a BBO sound system, for example, and then that's followed by something by Idols, and they're kind of really shouting, and it's very angular and noisy and, earnest. And yeah, and for me, the lyrics are like, oh, right, yeah, you've just cottoned onto that area of social injustice. Yeah. Okay.
No, I agree. I'm not really into it. But the vocal style for Fontaine DC, I can't really get on board with it. Don't really like it.
No, I mean, the thing is, ultimately, right, I'm 46 and I've sort of liked all sorts of different genres in my life, but ultimately I like soul music, and it doesn't mean I'm shut off to other sorts of music, but generally speaking, I just like soul music. That's what I listen to in my own time most of the time when I'm not listening to the radio. I like soul music. I like dance music. I like disco music, and I like every genre associated with that. So when you talk about sound, the sort of, the sonic experiences that I really enjoy, then, you can see Luther Vandross over here, right, which is about as smooth a sound as you can imagine and is the sort of thing I love. And then you think of Idols or Fontaines DC over there, and sonically they're so opposed, it's really hard. But I think it's the way that our brains are wired. I think that I don't know if there's any research about this or anything, but I think different people's brains respond to different sorts of noises. And I think it might literally be a physical thing. And that some people, and I think it might alter as well. Like, for instance, I never listened to jazz until like about 2 years ago. I used to think it was fucking ridiculous. Now I find myself listening to it a lot, especially when I'm working, because it sort of relaxes me and gets me, it helps me achieve real focus. And I think there's something clinical going on there, and I'm not quite sure what. But yeah, my mind is just now kind of tuned into smoother sounds and that kind of sound for me. You know what? I think I'm an old man now, so I just think I'm not going to slag them off because people love them and it's great. But I just think to myself, that stuff's for the kids.
Yeah. Okay, mate. Just one last one. It's a bit of a vague one that I sent you, but just if you had a funny story about interviewing one of the Gallagher brothers or just a big name in music, really.
Yeah, well, I did interview Noel Gallagher just about 2-3 years ago, which was very belated because, there was a time that he would have been, him and his brother would have been top of my list. And really, if they're honest, most journalists' lists, because there is no people, not just in music, but in any area of public life, who have delivered so consistently absolute elite level interviews to anyone they've ever spoken to. I mean, they should be given some sort of knighthood or OBE for services to journalism because they are just superb. And I remember just reading interviews from the NME, like occasionally NME would publish like just an Oasis special, and it would be like 10 years worth of interviews. And I'd read it like I was reading a comic. I would get these and I would just devour them and like laugh out loud, like be crying laughter, like I was reading a copy of Viz. They were so funny. And so I always wanted to interview both of them for different reasons. And for the Big Issue, who I now write for, I've got a column in the Big Issue, and occasionally they give me interesting interviews to do. And I was delighted when they asked a couple of years ago, we go and interview Noel Gallagher. And he was, everything I would want him to be. I turned up, I pressed record. I might have set him off with one small question. And then after that, I just had, what turned out to be about 2 hours worth. And the funny thing about that was when I went in, the presswoman sort of accosted me outside before I went into the room where he was sitting and said, I know you might have already been told this over email, but I can't stress to you enough. He does not want to talk about Liam. He does not want any of that. And I said, it's fine. It's old ground. Everyone's talked about that. It's done to death. I don't want to talk about that. And they said, okay. And I suppose a bit of me did, but I understood their point of view and I was respectful of it. And I thought, Joe, what? It doesn't matter. It's Noel Gallagher. You could talk to him about the fucking weather and it's still going to be absolute gold, And of course, I go in and we get on quite well because it turned out, we had a couple of mutual friends and he'd listened to me on Talk. He's a Talk Sport fanatic. And I, for quite a few years, presented on Talk Sport. So we kind of immediately, there was a familiarity. And I would say within 15 minutes, without any prompting from me, he had brought up Liam and just gone off on one about him for like half an hour without me being able to interject once. And the PR sitting in the room just looking horrified and confused and me just loving it and thinking, well, my hands are clean. I didn't fucking prompt any of this. He just can't help himself. So, that was really great. I interviewed Tom York once for a TV thing I was doing, and he was really quite rude and hostile. It was actually when I was reporting for ITN about the war in Iraq, and I was reporting on the Stop the War efforts, the campaign groups that were formed, and there's various things going on to sort of campaign outside Parliament, mostly against going to war in Iraq. Tom York became quite a prominent figure in that. And I went down to interview him in Parliament Square. And he struck me straight away, a bit like what I said about Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, as a bloke who had decided that all journalists were working to a secret agenda dictated to them by Murdoch or some other shadowy, press baron who was in the pocket of politicians and all those conspiracy theories. And really, I was just some fucking dickhead who liked listening. I was just some dickhead who liked listening to the Bends, right? And just took the opportunity to go and meet the bloke who sang the songs. And he was really like, it was him and I think it was Ed O'Brien, was there. And Ed O'Brien was very polite and kind. And every question I asked about the war, Tom York made this motion like he was stirring a huge bowl of porridge while sneering at me. Wow. And in the end, I said, what are you... I just had to break off because Ed O'Brien looked awkward and uncomfortable. And I said, why are you doing that? Sorry, we were on camera. I said, sorry, what? Every time I ask you something, you do this thing for ages, right? And he goes... You're just stirring the pot, aren't you? That's what your job is. You're stirring the pot. And I was like, literally, I've got no idea what you mean, but fine, whatever. And then we just continued the interview and Ed O'Brien just answered all the questions. And Tom York just sort of, I could have said anything. I'd say, so what do you think? What do you think your chances are of actually succeeding in stopping the government going to war? An innocuous, pretty softball question. And it was all this stuff. A cynical guffaw, as if, did your paymasters tell you to ask that one? And I'm like, mate, I don't fucking know. No one's. I just was told to go down to Parliament and interview Tom York. We don't get briefed, right?
Yeah.
But he was very like that, and that was a disappointment because I really am a huge Radiohead fan, as I suppose most right-minded people are.
Mm. It's weird. It's like, why has he agreed to do press if he's got that attitude?
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing was during that period in my career, I was doing shifts as a news reporter for ITN. So after my show had finished after a year, the show called The Edit, they asked me to stay on and actually be like a sort of a traditional news reporter on like the 7 o'clock news, where it's like Sam Delaney, Parliament Square. which I wasn't very good at and didn't particularly enjoy, but I did it because I needed the work, and it was quite interesting work as well. And so, but I was still writing. So, and I had still had my kind of longish sort of pseudo Britpop Liam Gallagher hairdo, right? But in the daytime, I would wear a suit because I had to, because I was on the news doing news reports. And in the evening, I would finish and I would get changed and I would go to a gig and interview a band. So it was like a double life. And I think that sometimes if you're interviewing someone like Tom York and you turned up in a suit, speaking in your best voice, minding your P's and Q's with an ITN cameraman with you, it maybe made him feel a little bit more cynical and hostile than had I turned up saying, hey, I'm here from The Guardian to interview you about your latest record. Maybe he would have been more open to discussing things with me. So things like that make a difference. But I remember doing a live two-way with the presenter, who was Kirsty Young, on another event. And I had one suit because I was young. I had bought one suit to do this job. But what I didn't have was a nice overcoat for when you were doing pieces to camera outside, and you wear a nice smart overcoat to go with it, don't you? But I didn't have one of those. Of course I didn't. I barely had a suit. But what I did have was a vintage Parker, like a proper old mod Parker, which was a 1960s US Army Vietnam jacket. And I had this long hair, and it was very cold, so my nose was bright red and my hair was everywhere and my eyes were watery from the cold. And while I was trying to stay focused and do a live two-way with the presenter in the studio, the producer, who was quite a good laugh, was like speaking in my earpiece, saying to me, oh, we've just had an email in from one of our regular viewers saying, why is there a tramp presenting the news? And I just thought, yeah, this job's not for me.